In the town where the air was always heavy with smoke and the river ran sluggish and dark, there stood rows of narrow houses pressed tightly against one another, their bricks blackened with soot. Spinner's End, it was called, though there were no spinners anymore, only remnants of industry and families who lingered in shadows of factories that had once breathed life into the place. The air carried the smell of oil and damp stone, and the evenings came quickly, as though the sun hesitated to linger too long. In one such house, tucked into the line of weary homes, a boy grew up with a quiet, watchful gaze. His name was Severus Snape. Even as a child, he was not like others. Where other children laughed and played in streets, Severus moved in silence, shoulders hunched, eyes too old for his age. His hair fell like curtains, black and uneven, veiling much of his face. He observed more than he spoke, storing every detail away as though he could weave safety out of knowledge. The house itself was not a kind place. His father, Tobias Snape, was a man whose temper burned quick and whose patience burned out faster. He was Muggle, bitter at the world and bitter at his wife, who was not like him at all. Eileen Prince had once been a witch of some promise, born into a pure-blood family with proud traditions. Yet by the time Severus was small, her pride had faded into sharpness, her voice cutting like broken glass. She had little warmth left to give, and the marriage that bound her to Tobias was more a battle than a union. So Severus grew in a house filled not with laughter, but with arguments that cracked like whips through thin walls. He learned to shrink into corners, to make himself small when voices rose. The narrow rooms smelled of dust and bitterness, and the boy who lived there clung to silence the way some children cling to toys. But there was something different about Severus, something that shimmered beneath the soot. He had magic. He did not always understand it at first, only that strange things happened when his feelings ran too deep. A door might slam without touch. A vase might crack and mend again. His father hated these things, muttering curses under his breath, while his mother scolded him in words too sharp to hide the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew what he was, and perhaps she feared for him, or feared what her own choices had made inevitable. Severus clung to those moments of magic, small though they were, because they reminded him he was not trapped forever in Spinner's End. The air may have been heavy, the streets narrow, but within him lay a spark that belonged to a larger world. At night, when shouting faded to weary silence and shadows deepened across ceiling, he would lie awake and imagine himself far away, wand in hand, no longer bound by his father's bitterness or his mother's sharpness. He found small ways to practice. Sticks became wands, and muttered syllables became incantations only he could hear. He had no books, no proper guidance yet, but he had instinct. He studied his own reactions carefully, noticing how anger or longing could bend reality in subtle ways. He thought of it as secret strength, hidden beneath shabby clothes and unkempt hair. Yet for all the sparks of magic, Severus was lonely. Children in Spinner's End avoided him, sensing his strangeness, mocking his thin frame and dark clothes. They shouted names at him, voices sharp with cruelty, and though he said little, his heart stored every insult like a shard of glass. He learned to glare instead of cry, to withdraw instead of plead. Loneliness became armor, though inside it weighed heavy. It was on one of those gray afternoons, wandering the edge of his neighborhood, that Severus first noticed the Evans family. Their house was brighter than the others, garden cared for, laughter spilling from windows. There were two girls, one older, one younger, playing in the fading light. Petunia, the elder, carried herself with primness, her movements neat and precise. But it was Lily who caught Severus's eyes, Lily with her red hair shining even against dull backdrop of Milltown. Lily, whose laughter sounded like sunlight, had taken voice. He watched from distance at first, intrigued, drawn by something he could not name. And then he saw it, the flower petals lifting when she passed, the small leaps of magic around her. She was like him, different, extraordinary. From that day, Severus began to linger by the river where Lily often played. He studied her, not with malice, but with hunger for connection. He had never seen another child like him, one whose magic spilled unknowingly into world. His heart raced when he thought of speaking to her, but he hesitated, afraid of rejection, afraid his strangeness would repel her as it repelled others. In Spinner's End, the boy's life continued in shadow, nights filled with muffled arguments, mornings with weariness. His clothes were always too large or too small, never quite right, and his shoes scuffed long before they should be. He found comfort in solitary exploration, abandoned factories, forgotten corners of town, riverbank where reeds whispered in wind. He collected scraps, feathers, odd stones, broken trinkets, treasures that only he valued, perhaps because they were overlooked by everyone else, like him. But through all of it, magic remained his secret refuge. He practiced in silence, coaxing sparks, bending twigs, imagining wand in hand. He felt power grow beneath surface, untrained but undeniable. It was both shield and promise, proof that he belonged somewhere beyond Spinner's End. Severus's childhood was not filled with light, yet within its shadows something important formed: resilience. He learned to endure, to sharpen mind when world offered no comfort. He became observer of people, noticing details others ignored, a habit born of survival, later weaponized as skill. He stored knowledge like one stores food in famine, each piece precious, each detail potentially useful. And always, behind watchful eyes, there lingered hope, faint but steady, that he was meant for more. He did not dream of glory, not yet. He dreamed of escape, of place where magic was not curse but gift, of someone who might look at him and not see only strangeness. Spinner's End remained his cage, but in its narrow confines Severus Snape was shaping himself. Quiet, lonely, sharp-edged, but burning within with hidden fire. A boy who had little love, but much potential. A boy who, in shadow of neglect, dreamed of something more. And soon, he would step onto riverbank and speak to Lily Evans for the first time. It was by the river that their paths crossed, the slow, winding water of Cokeworth running dark under smoke-stained skies. The place was ordinary to most reeds leaning in the wind, grass worn thin where children played, yet for Severus, it became the most important landscape of his childhood. For here was where Lily Evans laughed, and where he would finally gather courage to step from shadows and speak. He had watched her before, quietly, uncertainly. She was unlike the other children who lived near Spinner's End. They laughed cruelly, mimicked his clothes, his hair, his odd silences. But Lily, she was different. She moved through the world with a brightness that seemed untouched by soot or quarrels. Severus had seen her make petals dance, had seen her leap higher than any child should from a swing, had seen the world itself bend gently toward her. She had magic, though she did not yet know it. One summer afternoon, the sun was low, sky turning shades of pale gold. Lily stood with her sister Petunia, who was stiff and disapproving even at her young age. The two girls argued, Lily insisting she could do something wonderful, Petunia dismissing her as foolish. Severus, crouched behind tree, felt the moment like spark within him. It was time. He stepped forward, awkward and thin, hair falling across his eyes. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "You're not imagining it. You really can do things. You're like me." Lily turned, startled, and for a moment he feared he had ruined everything. But curiosity flickered in her green eyes, mingling with the surprise. Petunia frowned, arms crossed, suspicious of this strange boy from Spinner's End. Yet Lily tilted her head, considering. "What do you mean, like you?" she asked. Severus's heart pounded. Words tumbled out, clumsy yet earnest. He spoke of magic, of how their small tricks, hers with flowers, his with accidents that were not accidents, were signs of something more. He told her of Hogwarts, the school his mother had whispered about, where children like them were taught. He said it with quiet intensity, desperate to share the secret that had weighed on him alone for so long. Lily's face lit with wonder. Petunia scoffed, calling him liar, but Lily laughed, delighted at possibility. "Show me," she demanded. So he did. With trembling hands, Severus picked up leaf, held it flat on palm, and willed it to curl into tight rose-like spiral. It was crude, imperfect, but it moved. Lily gasped, eyes wide, and in that moment something bloomed between them, recognition. She was not alone, nor was he. From then on, they met often by riverbank. Lily asked endless questions, hungry for knowledge. Severus, who had always observed in silence, found himself eager to share, eager to impress. He spoke of wands, of spells half remembered from his mother's sharp lessons, of castle hidden in Scotland's hills where they would one day belong. Lily listened with rapt attention, her laughter ringing like music through dreary air. For Severus, those afternoons became lifeline. At home, walls pressed in with arguments and bitterness, but by river, he and Lily carved small sanctuary. They whispered secrets, practiced tricks, planned for future neither could yet touch. Severus felt alive in her presence. Her kindness reached into lonely corners of him, places he thought would remain cold forever. Petunia grew resentful, watching from distance, her face tight with disapproval. She sensed that Lily was being pulled into worlds she could not follow, and Severus, thin boy with dark eyes, became symbol of divide. Petunia's barbed words stung, but Lily brushed them aside, choosing to meet Severus anyway. One afternoon, as wind rippled through grass, Severus confessed more of himself. He spoke of his father, harsh and unforgiving, and of his mother, sharp yet resigned. Lily listened quietly, her eyes soft with pity. She told him of her own home, where quarrels were fewer, where warmth was easier. For a moment, Severus felt sharp envy, but it melted under her compassion. She did not mock his pain, she simply acknowledged it, and that was more than he had ever known. Sometimes they played with their magic. Lily would make petals drift into shapes, and Severus would try to match her, coaxing sticks to bend or stones to hop across water. They laughed when spells went wrong, and Severus felt strange joy in his own failures because her laughter warmed him. He stored each smile, each kind word, like treasure hoarded in secret chest. And yet, even in those golden afternoons, shadows lingered. Severus was acutely aware of differences. Her brightness, his darkness, her easy grace, his awkwardness. He adored her, but a part of him feared he might lose her to a world that always seemed to take what little he had. He grew protective, sometimes possessive, of her attention, for in Lily he found first glimpse of love, though he did not yet have word for it. As summer turned, Severus dreamed constantly of Hogwarts. He described it in vivid detail to Lily enchanted ceilings, moving staircases, lessons in spells and potions. He imagined them walking halls together, side by side, no longer outcasts but students of magic. It became his greatest hope, the thread he clung to when nights at home grew unbearable. One evening, he and Lily lay on riverbank, watching stars emerge. Severus pointed upward, whispering names of constellations his mother had once muttered. Lily listened, her hand brushing grass. "Do you think we'll really go there?" she asked. "Yes," Severus said fiercely, almost desperately. "We belong there." In that moment, his voice carried conviction that startled even him. He believed it, utterly. For Hogwarts was not just school. It was escape, salvation, chance to become more than lonely boy from Spinner's End. And Lily, she was part of that dream. Without her, it would feel hollow. But though their bond grew, tensions also simmered. Petunia's resentment sharpened, and Severus's bitterness toward ordinary world deepened. He clung to Lily all the more tightly, as though by holding her friendship he could hold back tide of rejection that always seemed near. Still, in those years before Hogwarts, they were happy in their secret world. A boy with dark eyes and a girl with red hair sat by river, discovering magic in themselves and in each other. The factory smoke, the narrow houses, the bitter voices at home all faded when they laughed together. For Severus, it was first and only light in childhood, otherwise heavy with shadow. He did not yet know how fragile it would prove, nor how fiercely he would cling to it even when years pulled them apart. For now, he only knew that Lily Evans was his friend, and in her presence, the boy from Spinner's End felt seen. And so, as summer waned, Severus Snape carried hope brighter than any he had ever dared to dream, that soon letters would arrive, and they would step into new world together. The summer before Hogwarts seemed endless, but for Severus Snape, each day crept by with a mix of anxious dread and fierce anticipation. He had imagined this moment for years, leaving behind Spinner's End, stepping away from narrow streets, from the cracked voice of his father and the cold sharpness of his mother. Soon he would enter the castle of stone and wonder, where magic would not be a whispered secret but a daily truth. The letter had come, parchment thick and creamy, words curling across it in emerald ink. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Even though he had known it was coming, Severus had held the envelope in trembling hands, eyes devouring every word. It felt like a promise, carved into reality. You belong. You are more than forgotten boy in soot-stained town. He shared the moment with Lily by the river. She too had received her letter, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. Together, they laughed and whispered of what awaited them: wands and lessons, feasts in Great Hall, staircases that moved, ghosts that drifted through corridors. Lily's laughter spilled across water like sunlight, while Severus clutched at the hope that Hogwarts would bind them closer, not pull them apart. But even in those early days, shadows lurked at edges of his hope. Petunia, who had once tagged along with Lily reluctantly, now seethed with bitterness. Severus overheard her once, voice sharp with envy, calling Lily a freak. It stung Severus too, though he was used to such words. What pained him more was Lily's hurt expression, the way she tried to hide tears from her sister's cruelty. Severus swore quietly to himself that he would protect her, always, once they were within castle walls. When September came, they boarded train together, steam hissing, platform bustling with parents and children. Severus carried second-hand trunk, patched robes folded inside. He felt awkward among students in finer clothes, their families chatting cheerfully. He caught glimpses of families hugging warmly, a world of affection so foreign it made his chest ache. Tobias Snape had not come to see him off, nor had Eileen, though she had muttered sharp instructions and pressed wand into his hand before he left. He was alone, except for Lily. On train, compartments filled quickly. Severus and Lily found seats together, laughter easing tension. For a while, it was as he had imagined. Her smile, his stories of spells, both dreaming of what lay ahead. But laughter from next compartment drifted in, voices louder, teasing. 4 boys leaned out, their presence like storm, entering calm air. James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew. They introduced themselves casually, but Severus felt weight of their eyes. James's hair was messy, his grin arrogant. Sirius's laughter was sharp, confident. They spoke to Lily with ease, as though they already belonged to world he still reached for. Severus bristled, his words turning cold, suspicious. The boys mocked his manner, his clothes, the way he spoke of Slytherin with pride. Lily frowned at their rudeness, but Severus felt first sting of what would become years of rivalry. The train rattled onward, fields rolling past, sky darkening as Scotland neared. Severus pressed face to glass at times, heart quick with anticipation. Yet unease grew too. James's mocking grin lingered in his mind, reminder that Hogwarts would not be sanctuary alone. When Castle finally came into view, it stole his breath. Towers rose against night sky, windows glowing like constellations, reflection rippling on lake below. Boats ferried them across dark water, lanterns bobbing. Lily's eyes widened with wonder. Severus's heart swelled with fierce pride. This was his world. This was where he belonged. Inside, torches blazed, great hall unfurling in magnificence, enchanted ceiling mirroring stars, banners draping walls, 4 long tables stretching endlessly. First years gathered, nervous, as Sorting Hat waited upon stool. Severus felt sweat on palms, Lily's presence steady beside him. When his name was called, he stepped forward, back straight, eyes defiant against whispers that rustled at his shabby robes. Sorting Hat slipped onto his head, voice filling his mind. Ah, yes, ambitious, resourceful, sharp, a hunger for recognition. You would do well in Slytherin, oh yes. But there is cleverness too, quick wit. Ravenclaw, perhaps? No, no, your path lies with serpents. You desire greatness, boy, and Slytherin will help you on your way. Severus barely hesitated. Slytherin, the house his mother had praised, the house of cunning and strength. Yes, he whispered fiercely. Yes, Slytherin. Hat cried aloud. Slytherin. Applause rose from green-draped table. Severus slipped off stool, relief mingling with pride, yet he glanced back once and saw Lily step forward. Hat spoke to her differently. Bravery, cleverness, kindness. In moments, it called Gryffindor. The red and gold erupted in cheers, and Lily walked away, leaving empty space where her presence had steadied him. That night, Severus sat among Slytherins, listening to introductions, names of families he only half recognized. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with disdain at his patched robes. He kept chin high, but his eyes strayed toward Gryffindor table, where Lily laughed with new companions. Pride for Slytherin warred with sharp ache of separation. Classes began, and Severus discovered both strength and vulnerability. In potions he excelled immediately, his mind precise, his intuition keen. Professor Slughorn noticed quickly, praising his skill, inviting him into favored circle. Severus basked in approval he had rarely known, though he never quite fit the easy laughter of Slughorn's chosen. Still, potions gave him confidence, proof of worth beyond shabby robes. But other lessons brought challenges. In defense against the dark arts, James Potter shone, his wand flicks natural, his confidence unshakable. Sirius matched him, laughter carrying through class. Severus's abilities were strong, but teachers overlooked him, distracted by charm of others. Bitterness coiled within him, dark and quiet. Hallways echoed with rivalries. James and Sirius teased him relentlessly, their words barbed. Severus fought back with sharp retorts, but mockery stung deeper than he admitted. Only Lily's kindness softened edges, her words in corridors reminding him they were still friends. Yet even that bond felt stretched, pulled between red and green banners. At night, in Slytherin dorms beneath lake, Severus lay awake, listening to water murmur against glass. Shadows drifted, green light filtering from depths. He thought of Lily's laughter at Gryffindor table, wondered if she drifted farther from him with each passing day. He promised himself he would prove worthy of house, of school, of her friendship. Ambition sparked within him, mingling with loneliness like two entwined threads. And so, Severus Snape's years at Hogwarts began years of brilliance in potions, years of rivalry with marauders, years of fragile friendship with Lily that would be tested again and again. The boy from Spinner's End had escaped soot-stained streets, but shadows still clung to him, for though he had reached the castle of his dreams, he would discover that belonging did not come easily, and love was never free of cost. The seasons at Hogwarts learned his name the way ivy learns stone, slowly, insistently, until it seemed he had always been there, a narrow figure moving like a shadow through torchlit corridors. Lessons stacked up like potion vials on a shelf, charms after herbology, ancient runes after defense each day measured by bells, by ink stains on fingers, by the feel of a quill pressed too hard when irritation climbed his spine. Severus pretended he was at ease, but in truth he felt the castle's warmth from the wrong side of the glass, close enough to fog the pain with breath, never quite inside the room where laughter lived. He was clever, relentless, tireless. He turned knowledge into armor. When other students slept, he copied diagrams until the parchment thinned beneath his pen, rewriting recipes with careful arrows and small, tidy improvements that no master had taught him. In those margins, in that secret tinkering, he felt almost safe. The Slytherin common room, with its green-soaked light and distant murmur of the lake against the windows, became a sort of second skin. He learned where to sit, so he could watch the door. He learned which third years would trade for a good charm, and which only traded in favors they would demand back with interest later. Mulciber and Avery drifted toward him, sharp smiles and sharper jokes, bringing whispers of hexes that felt like coals pressed into the palm. Too hot, too bright, strangely tempting. They recognized in Severus a mind that wanted edge and leverage, not noisy popularity, but a clean, quiet power that could turn humiliation to ash. He did not think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as balance. Out in the corridors, however, balance was an illusion. The Gryffindor quartet moved like weather, sweeping through classes with gusts of laughter and sudden squalls. James Potter's grin flashed like a thrown coin. Sirius Black's voice cut air into ribbons. Remus Lupin, quiet as a deep pool, watched with tired gentleness that never stopped the tide, and Peter Pettigrew scurried in their wake, starstruck. Severus kept his chin high when they passed. He held his books like a shield and measured the space between them, waiting for the moment when a foot would hook his ankle, when a spell would brush his sleeve like a wasp. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes everything did. Lily's presence threaded through those years like a bright ribbon. Severus did not often see her alone now. She had friends who loved her laugh, teachers who praised her wand work, a house that cherished her courage. Still, there were early mornings near the greenhouses, wind lifting the edges of her hair, when their eyes met and the old warmth flickered. You and I remember the river, the reeds, the way magic first felt like the secret name of joy. They spoke in quick exchanges between lessons, a few steps together down a hall, a shared smile over some teacher's pompous speech. But the space between houses grew like a crack that water finds and winter widens. He told himself the crack was not his doing. He told himself that loyalty to Slytherin required a flinty face and unblinking eyes. When Lily frowned at Mulciber's jokes, Severus shrugged as if the jokes were nothing. When she said, softly, "I don't like what he does to people," he found 1,000 clever deflections that were not, in truth, answers. If he admitted her complaint into his heart, something in him might have to break. Better to say she didn't understand how the school worked, that a Slytherin survived by knowing where each knife was kept. Nights lengthened. He wandered sections of the library where dust rose like breath from old lungs. He read not just the pages other students read, but the parts that made them uneasy. Footnotes, ink dark, about binding and unbinding. Old accounts of counter curses written in the dry voices of survivors. Potions that cooled rage and others that sharpened it to a point. In the quiet, he discovered a calm that felt like the center of a storm. If he could name a thing, perhaps it could not hurt him. If he could brew a remedy, perhaps the bruise would stop flowering beneath his skin before anyone saw. And yet, in daylight, the storm returned. There were days when James and Sirius seemed content to leave him alone. Quidditch practice swallowed their hours, girls swallowed their grins, or homework pinned them to chairs. Then there were days when irritation lay like a tripwire across Severus's path. A whispered charm would tangle his shoelaces. His bag would spill at the top of a staircase with comic timing that sent first years into peals of laughter. In defense, a mock duel might turn slyly into spectacle. His wand flicked from his hand by a spell too fast to block. His humiliation as neatly staged as theater. He grew older. The pranks grew sharper. Levitation was no longer a demonstration in a textbook, but a snare springing from nowhere. One ankle jerked skyward as though he were a rabbit caught by a trapper's line. The shock of blood rushing to his head made the world burn white around the edges, and the laughter rang like coins tossed onto a cold grave. Teachers intervened. Eventually, detentions were assigned, points flung like small change from one hourglass to another. None of it mattered. The currency of shame had no counter curse. Even so, there were moments of grace that kept him alive. Professor Slughorn's classroom, all copper glows and lemony polish, became a sanctuary where talent was its own passport. Severus's cauldrons glimmered with precision. His knife flashed through roots and pods with a jeweler's patience. He could take a published potion and make it work better. Cooler flame, slower simmer. A clockwise stir at the exact heartbeat before the brew turned. Tiny changes that any book would have missed. Slughorn's praise was a warm hand on his shoulder. It almost felt like belonging. He found a name for the version of himself who belonged, not the sallow boy in worn robes, but the son of Eileen Prince, the precise, thoughtful inventor in the margins. In the small, hidden theater of his notes, he signed his improvements with a private flourish, a jest that tasted like courage, like rescue, like privacy fitted perfectly to ribs. He did not speak that name aloud. He did not need to. The act of writing it was a charm that held him together. Lily noticed the calm that settled over him when he spoke about potions. She teased him gently, at first about the way he lived on the edge of a scowl, the way he wrapped himself in sarcasm like a cloak. "You don't have to be so sharp, Sev," she said once, sitting beside him on a low wall while leaves webbed the air with gold. "Not with me." He looked at the pattern of light on her hands rather than at her face. He wanted to say, "I am sharp because I am breakable, and I don't know how to be anything else." Instead, he made a joke that wasn't funny, and the moment passed. Slytherin's senior students were changing too. Conversations in the common room had a new vocabulary. Words like purity and tradition gathered like ice on the eves of the year. The older boys came back from holidays with an excited, brittle brightness that made Severus's skin prickle. They spoke of gatherings with men who wore masks not for carnival but for purpose. They asked questions that were not questions. "What do you want, Severus? What will you do when we graduate?" And the air around those words felt thin, as if all the oxygen had been used by someone else. He thought, "I want to be strong enough that no one can dangle me upside down in front of a crowd and laugh." He did not say it aloud. The school's calendar turned to the season of examinations. Libraries filled until the hush had its own pressure. Severus studied as if knowledge were a rope he could throw over a high branch and climb out of reach. He slept little, dreamed thin dreams, drank tea that tasted like old paper. Lily crossed his path in those weeks, sharing a piece of chocolate, a quick encouragement, the easy kindness that had always been hers. He treasured those crumbs of light, even as resentment sometimes flared at James hovering near her, at Gryffindor's noisy triumphs, at the fact that kindness could not change the mathematics of humiliation. The afternoon it happened was bright, heartlessly beautiful, the kind of day that sets a cruel contrast for any ugliness that chooses to occur beneath it. The lake wore the sky like a mirror, and students spilled across the grass, laughter jittering like dragonflies. Severus emerged from the exam hall with a head full of runes and a stomach that refused to settle. He chose a path along the water's edge that would take him near the beech tree where shadows made a cool stripe across the shore. He wanted quiet. He wanted to practice a defensive charm that still snagged in his throat. He wanted, perhaps, to see Lily and pretend the world was simple. What he found was the marauders in high spirits, their triumph, after a good exam, slopping over onto anyone unlucky enough to pass. The first jibe was a pebble tossed. It could have been ignored. The second was a handful of gravel. The third was a stone. James stepped in front of him with that careless mastery of space people have when they never expect to be refused. Sirius lounged on the grass with a wand in his fingers, as if it were a pen rather than a weapon. Peter's laugh skittered. Remus looked away. Severus felt his temper thin, wire-taut, vibrate. It would have been safer to back away, to slide into shade, to bide his time. But shame he had swallowed for years rose like flood water. He reached for his wand with too much haste, and that was all James needed. The spell came almost lazily, a flick, a flourish, a smirk. Up Severus went, yanked by the ankle into the sky, robes falling, pockets spilling, dignity hanging like a stripped branch. The shout that rose from the onlookers was a round, bright thing, as if they had rehearsed it. He could hear individual voices in that chorus, someone's delighted "oh," someone's bark of laughter, someone's sympathetic "leave him, that's enough." That meant nothing. Blood pulsed harshly in his ears. The world swung. His wand, knocked aside, lay in the grass like a fish out of water. He hated them for their ease. He hated himself for the sound that tore out of his throat when he tried to twist free and could not. It was a bad sound, the sound of a small animal that knows the trap won't open. Lily's voice cut through the crowd, clear as a silver knife through cloth. She pushed forward, green eyes bright with anger, and planted herself between Severus and the laughter, as if she were a shield he had earned. "Enough," she said, and though the word was simple, the way she said it drew a line on the ground that even the wind would not cross. James made a quip that thought it was charming. When it failed to charm her, he made another. Lily did not laugh. She turned towards Severus, and for a moment he could breathe. Shame is a fast alchemist. It takes one ingredient, humiliation, and makes a burning substance that sticks to whatever it touches. Hanging there, blood throbbing, Severus felt that fire crawl through him. It found every memory of being mocked, every night spent memorizing spells while other boys slept easy, every time he had watched Lily's smile drift toward someone else. It found Mulciber's insinuating voice promising power enough to melt these chains. The words that leapt to Severus's tongue were not chosen. They were reflex, the way a hand jerks from a flame. They were ugly. They were the cheapest currency the school's worst mouths ever minted. He spat that word, the slur, the one he knew would cut her to the bone because the boys who tormented him had thrown it at her too, like a stone wrapped in glass. He saw Lily's face change as if a candle had been blown out behind her eyes. The world went very quiet, and the sway of the lake made the silence tilt. James dropped him. The spell ended. The crowd diffused, embarrassed in the wake of an ugliness that no longer looked like a prank. Severus hit the ground with the gracelessness of a sack. He scrambled up, sick with adrenaline, sicker still with the knowledge of what he had done. Lily stared at him, as though a stranger had stepped into his skin. He opened his mouth to apologize, to throw words at the hole he had torn, words like, "I didn't mean it, and I'm sorry and please," but pride twisted his tongue into knots. Around them, the afternoon went on being beautiful. The apology came later, in a corridor that smelled of wax and dust, when the heat of humiliation had cooled into its more dangerous cousin, regret. Severus waited where he knew she would pass. He rehearsed his contrition with the same meticulous care he used on potions. He even tried to calculate which syllables might be most persuasive, which vulnerabilities to confess, how much to reveal without spilling his entire heart onto the floor. When Lily turned the corner, he stood too straight, sounded too formal, and all that preparation crumbled. She listened because kindness was part of who she was. She told him she believed he was sorry because truth mattered to her. And then she told him that some doors, once closed, were heavy. He watched her walk away and felt something in him tilt forever. After that day, the crack between them widened into a ravine that maps would mark as uncrossable. He told himself it was James's fault, and it was. In part, he told himself it was Gryffindor's smugness, and that too had its portion. But underneath those comfortable narratives, Severus understood the geography more precisely than anyone could have guessed. He had built a bridge out of pride and pain, and then he had set fire to it with his own word. The school's gossip machine, fed by corridor whispers and common room retellings, worked as it always did. Lily's name and his were twined in 100 versions of the story, some kinder than others. James's swagger grew new decorations. Sirius's laughter found new edges. Severus moved through the aftermath like a man walking through a room after a lamp has gone out, hands extended, expecting to find familiar furniture and banging into sharp corners instead. The library offered him its old anonymity. The lake offered its old cold gaze. The dungeons offered their dark, which matched his inside. Mulciber and Avery received him with a sympathy that felt like velvet hiding hooks. They spoke to him of fairness, of the insult of being judged by people born into a different shape of luck. They offered him jinxes that would make laughter stop mid-breath, and hexes that made arrogance curdle like milk left in Sunday. It was easy to nod. It was easy to say yes to anything that looked like control. He doled out his hurt like raw ingredients, and the boys he let themselves be were eager to teach him the recipes that turn pain to power. He did not abandon his studies. If anything, he clung more tightly to them, adding hours to already long nights, as if excellence could erase the bruise on his name. Slughorn continued to beam at his work, to hint about opportunities after school, to flatter him with selections for small parties where students laughed carefully and ate sugared fruit. Severus attended and smiled when necessary. His mind was miles away, in old books that did not ask him to be pleasant, in lab notes that obeyed when he commanded them to shine. There were still occasional glimmers at a distance, Lily's head bowed over a book, the gleam of her hair in a shaft of light, a sound of her laughter across a courtyard, but he did not step into them. Once, when they met by chance near the owlery, they exchanged half a dozen words about homework and weather and the state of the owl's tempers. Their voices were perfectly polite. The politeness burned worse than any insult ever had. It told him the story was not paused. It was finished. The months that followed carved him deeper. He carried himself with a composure that some mistook for confidence. It was actually concentration, a constant effort not to break. When the marauders passed him in a hall, he did not flinch. When he encountered Professor McGonagall's steady gaze, he felt briefly what it might be to be seen without scorn. Then he hurried on. When Madame Pomfrey mended a bruised wrist or stitched a cut from a miscast spell, he was moved by her efficiency, by the hush of care that did not demand anything back. He filed away those observations. He did not know why he was keeping them. He suspected he would need them later. Examinations returned, as they always do, marking time like ritual. Severus's marks remained high, his reputation for brilliance in his discipline unchallenged. His reputation for bitterness hardened too, the way a glaze hardens on pottery when you put it to fire. He rarely laughed. When he did, it startled even him. In the same period, rumors thickened in the air beyond school grounds, rumors about a man gathering followers, about serpents and skulls and speeches made in rooms where curtains were drawn in the middle of the day. Older students left for weekends and came back quieter or bolder. It was hard to tell which. Severus listened without appearing to listen. He had learned that true things often travel dressed like gossip. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the lake's pressure pressed the windows of the Slytherin common room and green light breathed like a sleeping creature, Severus allowed himself to recall the river of his childhood. Spinner's End had been grim, but the reeds had learned his shape. The water had given him a mirror when no one else would. He thought of the first time Lily had seen him, the first test he'd performed with a leaf and a wish, the first time he had felt chosen by anything. Those recollections were not comforts. They were like old letters found in a drawer, read by lamplight until the paper grew translucent under tears that did not fall. If this sounds like unrelenting sorrow, it was not entirely so. Teenagers, even brilliant and wounded ones, are not statues of grief. The castle offered small mercies, a good joke from an unexpected source, a day of snow that turned roofs to cakes and courtyards to muffled theater, a choir's rehearsal heard through a half-open door, harmonies resting on stairwells like warm birds. Severus was not immune to beauty. He simply did not know how to hold it for long without squeezing until it fled. He wondered, Sometimes, what would have happened if he had learned to say softer words at the precise moments when harder words burst out? He wondered what it would have been to carry his grief like a lantern instead of a weapon. He wondered these things the way a traveler looks back at a branch in a road from a hill 2 miles on, uselessly and with exquisite clarity. Then he closed the book on those thoughts and returned to the work that was in front of him. If he could not be loved, he could be formidable. If he could not be forgiven, he could be feared. If either of those sounded like a vow, it was only because he could not bear to admit he was making one. The year drew toward its end. The castle's clocks went on striking, indifferent to human drama. The lake went on breathing. Owls went on ferrying secrets whose ink darkened or faded according to the wind or the courage of the hand that wrote them. Severus moved through that rhythm with the care of a man walking a high and narrow path. He told himself he was only doing what anyone in his place would do. He told himself that safety, finally, was just another name for the absence of witnesses. But safety is a story we tell at dusk. Night has a way of asking new questions. In the dark, Severus felt the pull of voices beyond the walls, promises wrapped like gifts, whose ribbons were the very color of his house. He listened. He thought he was too clever to be swept. He thought he could visit the edge and choose his own distance. He did not yet understand that the edge has a hunger. So the shadow of the marauders lay long across his school years, and the longer shadow of his own choices grew beside it, a twin that learned to match him step for step. Love and fury, shame and pride, genius and loneliness, all of them changed shape in those corridors, as if the castle were a great slow mirror that taught each face how to become the one it would wear at the end. Severus learned how cruelty feels in the mouth and how regret tastes in the blood. He learned which doors open to a touch and which require a word he no longer possessed. There were still bells. There were still classes. There were still the measurable things by which anyone might claim that a year had passed and work had been accomplished. But beneath those measurable things, the unmeasured, ungraded lessons went on. The education of a heart too quickly armed and a mind too quickly sharpened. He did not yet hear the prophecy that would pierce the fabric of all their lives. He did not yet kneel in Dumbledore's office and trade one future for another. All of that waited ahead. For now, he stood in the lengthening shade, clutching the small, bright instruments of the only art that had never failed him, and told himself that next year he would hold the blade steadier. And when summer came and trunks closed and the train drew breath like a great animal and exhaled steam that smelled of iron and departure, he took his seat and watched the countryside roll toward the soot and narrow rooms he could not stop calling home. He stared at his reflection in the window and tried to decide whether he looked like someone on the verge of power or someone drifting. His face did not answer. Outside, fields waved like a crowd. Inside, he tuned his silence like a string. What he did not know and could not have known then was how the shadows he was learning to live with would one day become the very material of a life's work. That the humiliation he burned with would be repurposed into a weapon he would turn, at cost, on himself. That the word he had flung like a blade would take years to dull even under the constant abrasion of repentance. For now he leaned his head back against the seat and let the early evening light smear itself across the carriage. The world, as ever, looked gentle from a distance. Closer, it had teeth. He told himself that adulthood would be a different country, that once he stepped beyond the castle's threshold and the bells and timetables and prefect patrols, he would breathe a larger kind of air. He was right. In a way, the streets of London were wider than any corridor, and the night spread itself like a map with too many uncharted corners. But leaving school did not erase the habits that had grown around his bones. He still moved like a shadow. He still measured rooms by exits and people by what they wanted. He still sharpened silence until it could cut. Work, at first, was whatever he could make, with his hands and his mind and his precise, unsplashing patience. There were apothecaries willing to pay for a boy who could brew without burning, who could coax stubborn ingredients into marrying without sulking, who could decant without waste. In the back rooms of respectable shops, he improved recipes in whispers. In less respectable basements, he was shown vials that glowed faintly like sullen animals, and asked what else might be possible. He learned to lay out glassware like a constellation, and to keep the floor clean even when the world above it was not. He rented a narrow room that looked, in the right light, like a corridor that had given up and decided to be a room. He bought a kettle, and a chair, and a single plant that refused to die. Nights stretched thin and long, and into them he poured work. He read until letters blurred. He brewed until the air tasted of clove and iron. He told himself this was freedom. He told himself the quiet meant peace. Some nights he believed it. Letters arrived sometimes, one with Slughorn's generous looping hand, enclosing a clipping about a fellowship he might pursue, one with Eileen's precise, tired script, scolding him for not visiting and for visiting at the wrong times. None with Lily's hand. He had not expected one. He had imagined one. He had torn up imaginary letters in his mind before they could hurt him. Instead, he found her name in the Daily Prophet beside James Potter's, and he put the paper down with careful hands, as if it were a hot pan that must be set on a trivet to save the table beneath. Meanwhile, the city had its own curriculum, and Severus learned it quickly. There were pubs where wizards spoke loudly because they were being listened to, and others where they spoke quietly because they were listening. There were thresholds that required a password, and thresholds that required a gift, and thresholds that required nothing but willingness to step over. In the dimmest corners, men and women of a certain fervor gathered, and their talk had the weight of inevitability. They did not call themselves anything at first. They referred to a man by titles visionary, reformer, scholar of old ways, with a reverence that felt both devotional and practical. Severus recognized the tone from school, the way eager boys spoke about older boys, who could make doors open with a word. The first time he heard the name spoken plainly, the room seemed to shift, as if the architecture itself had a different idea of where its corners should be. Voldemort. The syllables sat in the air like a coin laid carefully on a table. The man himself, they said, had no time for messy indulgence. He had a plan, and the plan was not a fantasy, but a series of steps. He offered clarity where the ministry offered paperwork. He offered power where the world offered embarrassment. He offered, above all, a place to stand for those who had always been told to kneel or to laugh along. Severus did not join in a single night. He told himself he was studying a phenomenon. He said the words, observer, and opportunity to himself, and tasted how similar they were when chewed. He went back to his room and read more. He improved a soothing draught by 2 seconds of stirring and 3 drops of tincture of thyme, and the result pleased him in a way that had nothing to do with politics. But the people who had found him, the ones who smiled with the same sharpness he remembered from the green-lit common room, did not let go. They brought him questions and admiration is a key that opens locks self-respect cannot. He tried on the mask of belonging the way one tries on a coat in a shop. He put his arms through the sleeves and examined his reflection critically. The cut suited him austere, clean lines, dark cloth that did not show stains. With it came tasks, a shipment moved, a meeting guarded, a message memorized and delivered. He did them as he did everything, precisely. He did not boast, he did not swagger. If anyone asked why he was there, he said the word future and let them layer their own meanings into it. Power is rarely a single door. It is a series of thresholds, each disguised as a step you have already taken. Severus stepped, a sigil learned, a vow whispered, a mark burned where no one could miss it. The pain was brief, the memory of it was not. It felt, later, like a second spine, an extra structure around which his choices wrapped themselves. The others called themselves brothers and sisters, with the ease of people who had rehearsed, and sometimes he felt the warmth of that invented kinship. Sometimes he felt only the heat of the brand. The work he was given followed the contour of his talent. He brewed and refined. He translated old recipes written by hands that had long since turned to dust. He made filters that could blur a mind's edge and antidotes that could rescue a life a minute from the cliff. He brewed for the cause, and he brewed for the commerce that greased the cause, and he brewed for the joy of making something perfect. That last joy embarrassed him, so he hid it like a guilty sweet. When a superior praised a batch for its potency, he bowed his head. When a comrade sighed with relief at how cleanly a toxin cleared a blood, he nodded. Neither of them knew how carefully he had watched the cauldron at the one breath that decides between brilliance and catastrophe. It was his secret, the only one he owned outright. He saw cruelty done. He did not always do it himself. Sometimes he was in the next room with a bottle that would stop a heart and another that would restart it, waiting for an order. Sometimes he stood in a doorway and cataloged things: the angle of a spell's entry, the duration of a scream, not out of sadism, but because his mind, trained to measure, could not stop measuring, even when what lay on the scale was a sin. He told himself the world was already cruel. He told himself order required force. He told himself he could choose where to place his cleverness, and thus blunt a blade that someone less careful might wield. Sometimes that was even true. At the edges of all this, the old ache remained, a tooth that never stopped tugging at the jaw. Lily lived in the same world, but not in his rooms, not in his circles, not in his future, as he had once imagined it. When he saw her across Diagon Alley one spring afternoon, her hair a flag in the light, her laughter unbroken, he stepped into a doorway so quickly he banged his shoulder and nearly knocked a stack of second-hand cauldrons into a clangor. He watched her choose a book. He watched Potter pay for it as if money were simply another way to admire himself. He watched the way they looked at each other as though the world were a place designed to fit the two of them, and the pain was clean and total. He went home. He put the kettle on. He told himself there were potions that could cool a fever, could quiet a delirium, could stop a heart, could start one, but none that could reroute a life. He sat and waited for the water to boil, and the whistle sounded like a laugh that no longer belonged to him. And then, one winter night, in a village whose name did not matter, he followed an order that took him to the upstairs room of an inn where the fire had gone to embers and the chairs were the wrong size for the people who used them. A hooded figure sat in a corner, a woman whose mouth was stubborn and whose eyes were tired. She had been drinking tea to stay awake. She had not been sleeping much. She had not expected to hear what she heard. The barman had not expected to serve the person he served. Everything in the room felt slightly skewed, as if the floor were not level. The old barman, who knew everyone's business and pretended not to, glanced at the newcomer's wand and decided not to hear anything except orders. The inn's walls, which had listened to centuries of secrets, leaned in. Severus stood in the dark at the landing, not in the room but not far from it, and the words floated out like ash. A prophecy is only a sentence. It is also a map and a nullification of maps. He heard it in pieces, but not in fragments. Born as the seventh month dies, those who have thrice defied, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The language had ritual in it and dust, a sense of the inevitable dressed as the avoidable and vice versa. He did not stay to hear the scrape of a chair, or the argument that followed, or the barman's anxious cough. He went down the back stairs and out into air that had turned to glass in the cold, and he made for a door that opened without a knock when you needed it to. He delivered the words to a man whose face did not change as he listened, whose eyes did, a little, whose hand stroked a serpent as if it were a thought he intended to keep until it ripened. Severus said what he had heard. He did not add what he had felt. He did not say that the room had seemed to pull itself taut, as if the building were holding its breath. Voldemort nodded while Severus spoke. He asked 2 questions, in a voice so soft it made the hair on Severus's arms lift. Severus answered. There was approval in the air, like a narcotic. He was dismissed with a gesture that felt like a ribbon in the air. He went home, sat down, and did not sleep. It took hours for him to understand what his bones had already told him the moment he heard the words. The parents who had thrice defied, the children due at the end of July, the families in danger. He knew 2 couples who fit. He cared, foolishly, catastrophically, about one of them. He went to the mirror. He watched his own mouth shape a name he had not said aloud in months. He left his room before the kettle could boil. Dumbledore's office had always smelled faintly of lemon pastilles and phoenix ash. It still did. The bird on the perch watched him with the grief of a creature who knows how often life requires being born out of one's own dying. Severus stood in a place where he had once stood as a student, and his body remembered every posture, the straightened spine, the respectful lift of the chin, the hands held at an angle that read, humble to the untrained eye and defensive to the trained one. He did not waste politeness. He did not waste time. He said what he knew, as if each word were a stone he had to carry to an altar. He said please, as if the word had teeth. Dumbledore listened, as if listening were the chief art of leadership. He did not flinch. He did not pounce. He asked one question, and it was not the question Severus expected. What will you give me in exchange for her life? That was the shape of it, stripped of diplomacy. Severus's answer was the only one that mattered. Anything. The word left his mouth like blood from a cut. It left a taste. It left a scar you could not see. Anything, then. Dumbledore named the terms of anything. He named them quietly, as if to soften them, but their weight did not change with the volume. He asked for a spy. He asked for a double life. He asked for a man to become a hinge between 2 doors and to be crushed, daily, by the closing of both. He did not promise success. He did not promise that Lily would live. He did not say the word redemption, because that is a fairy tale word, and he was not a fairy tale man. He said work. He said secrecy. He said trust, as if it were a shard of glass that could cut the hand that held it. Severus said yes to all of it, because the other choice was no, and no meant a grave. He left the office heavy with a bargain and light, with a hope so narrow it could thread a needle. Days became knives. He moved through rooms where plans were made to turn a prophecy into a hunting license. He moved through other rooms where a man with half-moon spectacles sketched countermeasures with the calm of a chess player who knows the board is already a little wrong. He delivered. He listened. He brewed. He ran messages that were also tests of loyalty, that were also traps, that were also bridges. He learned that there are lives lived at the edge of a blade, and that the edge has weather, fog, wind, ice. When the Dark Lord chose a target, Severus felt the world tilt in the precise way his dread had predicted and his hope had denied. The Potters. The boy with the hair his father had made into a joke, and the eyes his mother had turned into a promise. He went back to Dumbledore, wild with fear that was too large to stand upright in the narrow room of his skull. He begged. He bartered. He asked for anything and was told anything had already been asked for. Hide them, he demanded, and found that his voice had become the voice of a man whose control is cracking. Dumbledore said he would do what he could. Dumbledore said the words that can mean comfort or merely the end of a conversation. Trust me, there is a peculiar quiet that comes before a disaster, a stillness that feels like the air has turned viscous and your limbs must push through it. Severus lived in that quiet for weeks. He went out only when he had to. He brewed until the walls of his room smelled of wolfsbane and rue. He dreamed of a door he could not open with any key, of a house whose address changed each time he looked at the parchment. He dreamed of a woman at a window looking at stars she could not name because their names had been taken into hiding with her. He woke with his hands clenched around nothing. The news, when it came, arrived in pieces, like crockery dropping one item at a time from a shelf in the next room. A house in Godric's Hollow torn open like an envelope. A Dark Lord vanished. A child alive and marked. A man dead on the floor. A woman on the nursery floor where no woman should be found. Severus heard the first piece sitting on the edge of his bed. He stood to receive the second. He did not sit again for a long time. He walked out into the city because the room that had held him through so many midnights could not hold this grief. The city did not know. The city continued. The city's windows glowed with other people's dinners, other people's fires. He found Dumbledore not because he knew where he would be, but because the world had narrowed to two poles, and the old man was one of them. The other was a grave that could not comfort him. In a corridor shadowed by portraits that pretended to sleep, Severus begged for what was no longer possible. The sound tore out of him. It was not articulate. It did not have to be. Dumbledore's face changed the way weather changes, not with a gesture, but with a temperature. He said things. They were true. They were insufficient. He held Severus up with words and hands until Severus could inhabit his own skeleton again and not fall through it. After, the work did not end. When a war loses its head, the body thrashes. There were Death Eaters who fled, and those who hid, and those who believed this was only an intermission, and they must rehearse for the second act. There were raids to undo, and raids to prevent, and raids to pretend to help with so that later they could be stopped. Severus took his place on the hinge. He played his part so well that he sometimes scared himself. The voice that could be frost, the stare that could be a door shutting, the contempt that he could summon like a hex from an unmarked holster. He knew what people thought of him. He cultivated it. It made the work easier. It made sleep harder. He did not sleep much anyway. He went to the place where the house had been. He did not go in the daylight. He did not go when the curious came with their picnic shame and looked at ruins like a fairy tale set. He went at an hour when even owls consider silence wise. He stood where a nursery had been. He did not enter. He pressed a hand to a piece of stone no larger than his palm and told himself that touch is not ownership, but it is something. He stood a long time because leaving felt like betrayal and remaining felt like a performance. He left. He returned some weeks later. He repeated the ritual until it had the shape of a prayer. Years folded, and with them the ministry's confidence that a vanquished enemy stays vanquished. Dumbledore saw further than the posters with their triumphant fonts. Severus learned to walk longer distances along the knife's edge. He learned how to tell a story with his face, while his mind calculated a rescue 2 steps away. He took a post at the school he had not imagined returning to except in the form of a ghost, Potions Master. The title sat on his desk like a jar of something preserved, formaldehyde and pride. He frightened students because fear made them precise, and because fear made them leave him alone. He issued detentions because children need walls against which to discover their own edges. He said essays that were 3 times as long as they needed to be because there are some poisons you can only learn to handle by spending a long evening breathing their perfume without passing out. The castle was the same, and not the same. He knew the turns that would carry him without creak past a sleeping portrait. He knew which stair preferred to be flattered. He could walk from his rooms to the great hall and keep his face as smooth as lake ice, even when he was carrying news wrapped like a parcel that might explode. He might pause at a window, one particular window where the gray of the sky matched the river that had once been his private planet, and permit himself half a breath of memory. He never allowed a full breath. He had learned what floods do. The name he did not say beat under his words like a second pulse. Sometimes he sat at his desk and wrote letters he did not send. He addressed none of them. He folded them into nothing and let the fire take them, as if sorrow could be converted cleanly into warmth. He could not speak to the boy whose eyes matched hers. Not yet. That was another threshold, and beyond it waited things he had promised to do. The promises kept him upright, they also cut. He bled in ways that did not show. His life had narrowed to essentials by then. The lesson, the watch, the brew, the report, the mask. Somewhere beyond those nouns was a verb he could only approach without saying, love. It did not soften him. It did not save him. It made a path where none had been, and he walked it because turning around was no longer an option, and standing still would have been a confession he was not willing to make, not to enemies, not to allies, not to himself. So he moved between darknesses, carrying a candle he refused to admit he carried. He set it in places where its light would not betray him, and where it might, nonetheless, keep someone from breaking their shin on a table the night left in the wrong place. He spoke harshly to children who needed someone to be a wall for them to throw themselves against until they learned how not to. He sent messages that saved lives and messages that ended them. He brewed antidotes with the patience of a saint and toxins with the precision of a sinner, and would not have accepted either title. If you had asked him then whether he was lost, he would have given you a look that made lesser men reconsider their hobbies. If you had asked whether he knew the way, he would have said yes with a conviction that sounded like the blade it was. In truth, he was walking toward a door that could not open, until a boy grew into the height of his mother's gaze, and a wand chose a gesture that would end one life and change another. In truth, he was walking toward a night on a tower, under a sky that had watched him practice contempt as a dialect and devotion as a secret language. In truth, he had already chosen the kind of man he would be when he turned to face that night, and the choice had been made in a back room of an inn, and in an office that smelled of lemon and ash, and in a nursery that no longer existed, and on a riverbank, in a town that no longer remembered how to spell joy. For now, only for now, he finished a lesson, corked vials, cleaned glass until the room held its quiet like a balanced equation, and stood at a window while night pressed its face to the panes. Somewhere, a phoenix shifted on a perch and woke the embers into a brighter red. Somewhere else, a snake uncoiled, patient as drought. Severus pressed 2 fingers to the place where a mark once throbbed with a master's call and felt nothing, which did not mean safety. He turned down the lamps. He set a ward that hummed exactly as it should. He went to a bed that had learned his shape. He did not sleep. He learned, in those years, how to keep 100 clocks ticking inside his chest without letting a single chime escape his lips. Dawn meant lessons and detentions, and the daily theater of a man who disliked children loudly enough that no one asked why he noticed everything they did. Afternoon meant reports encrypted into the ordinary, a question too casually asked in the staff room, a glance traded at the far end of a corridor, a scrap of parchment that could be mistaken for a shopping list until you touched it with the right charm and watched the ink turn. Night meant cauldrons and calculations in corridors patrolled with a gate that made mischief retreat like a tide. Between those hours, he waited for the world to reveal the next angle from which it intended to break him, and he rehearsed, not breaking. The boy arrived, and with him the eyes Severus had not allowed himself to meet in any mirror for a decade. He had prepared for it, of course prepared with sarcasm, with strictness, with a tone honed into something that could file the rough edges off a room in a single sentence. He had told himself disdain would be a shield, that if he pushed the child away, he would keep him safer than any kindness could. But the first time those green eyes lifted toward him, Lily's eyes set in a face that was not hers. His practiced contempt trembled, and he had to reach for something harder than mere tone. He reached for the discipline of a spy. You are not a man in love. You are a wall and a task. The school year unfolded into its familiar shape, but the pattern meant different things now that the boy sat in those rows, now that whispers gathered whenever he walked past. Severus watched Harry's clumsy heroism harden into habit. He watched luck masquerade as destiny. He watched James's swagger resurrect itself in a tilt of the head, a broom handled too confidently, a grin thrown around like a coin in a tavern. When the boy succeeded, Severus's relief came out sideways, as barbed remarks meant to force precision into a child who ran on instinct. When the boy failed, Severus's anger sparked because failure was a crack where danger could pour in. No one watching from the stands could have guessed that the icy teacher and the impulsive student were bound by a promise forged in the hottest room of the world. There were other promises to keep. Dumbledore moved through the castle like a man walking across a map only he could see. Sometimes he was a step ahead of disaster. Sometimes he arrived at the exact moment the disaster required for its own undoing. He asked Severus for things that sounded small. Observe this. Remember that. Say to the boy exactly what you would say if you couldn't say what you mean, and each small thing was a latch in a long sequence of locked doors. Sometimes Severus hated him for his calm, for the way he held grief like a cup of tea that must be drunk while it is strong, not scalding. Sometimes Severus loved him with a ferocity reserved for men who have told you the truth when everyone else offered a prettier lie. Mostly, he obeyed, because obedience was the price of the only vow that mattered. Years turned. The castle dimmed and brightened according to dangers outside it. Dark marks returned to the sky like bad weather relearned by a coastline. Severus walked the knife in both directions and felt it thin beneath his weight. He gave the Dark Lord enough truth to keep his position. He fed Dumbledore enough of the lie to build a labyrinth in which a boy might survive. He taught children who would grow into men and women who would choose, and he wondered which essays came from hands that would one day hold wands in rooms where cruelty was the most eloquent language. He took points for sloppiness, with a severity that made students think he lived for humiliation. He did it because sloppiness is a door left on the latch. There is a particular cold that enters a man when he must teach a child to close his mind and finds, in every lesson, a mirror turned toward a face he would rather not see. Occlumency became another of those corridors where Severus and Harry walked the same direction but did not travel together. The boy could not hold a wall. He could not stop memories from frothing at the top of his mind like a potion about to boil over. And Severus, pressed into the intimacy of those lessons, caught flashes he had not consented to see. A cupboard, a shouted insult, a loneliness so loud it cracked the glass around his own. In return, the boy, careless, frightened, tired, caught a slice of Severus's past too, a scene in which a father's rage was a weather system and a mother's magic, a small lamp flickering under a storm, a schoolyard humiliation that still hurt the skin years after the bruise had faded. They recoiled from the contact like men who had brushed the same live wire. The lessons did not heal them. They did perhaps keep them alive. The world outside the castle organized its dread into schedules and plans. Men gathered in old houses and said the word war with an ease that made Severus's stomach turn. Women packed satchels in the night and wrote letters that began "if." Spies met under the roofs of places where the ceiling paint peeled. Names changed hands like contraband. In such a landscape, a ring found in a house that had been a house for centuries and a curse that had been breathing in it for almost as long were not unexpected, and yet they were catastrophic. It was not Severus who found the ring, but it was Severus who saw the wound, after saw the black spreading like ink dropped into water, saw the death that had been put on a leash but not a long one. Albus presented that wound to him the way a man presents a hand he knows must be amputated. There was no panic. There was urgency, clean, not frantic. "We have time," Dumbledore said, and Severus heard both meanings. Some time left to live, no time left to waste. The counter-curses he cast that night were the kind that do not live in books because the men who wrote the books understood that only a handful of hands would ever be steady enough to trace them. He held Dumbledore upright against death, long enough to let a larger plan be written. It is a strange intimacy to be the one who reaches into another's life with a thread and needle, tying it a while longer to the world. The plan itself was not a single page. It was a sheaf. It had a title that sounded like defeat and read like mercy. It asked Severus to become, more perfectly than he had ever been, the monster so many already believed him to be. It required an ending that would look like murder, even to the boy for whom the murder was meant as scaffolding. Severus accepted because refusal would have been refusal of Lily's life in its afterlife, refusal of the promise he had made, refusal of the logic he had bled to keep. He accepted because Dumbledore asked the worst thing you can ask of a man and then held his eyes while he accepted, so there would be no misunderstanding about the price. Between the ring and the tower, other obligations braided themselves into the rope that tugged him forward, an oath spoken in a drawing room where the curtains were heavy and the air heavier. Narcissa Malfoy came like a woman who had walked all day in shoes made for a person who sits. She asked for a promise that could not be kept by anyone who wanted to live cleanly. Bellatrix, with a laugh like a blade sharpened on a mirror, demanded proofs that loyalty had no back door. Severus gave them what they came for, because promises made in rooms without light are sometimes the only light that can be carried out. He swore the unbreakable vow. He felt the magic tighten around his wrist, a braided cord pulled snug by fate's patient hands. He told himself that the vow and Dumbledore's request were not contradictions but coordinates on the same map. Then came nights when Draco Malfoy's steps echoed in corridors like a boy trying to walk in his father's boots. The castle had always been a maze, but that year it learned new tricks. Secret paths repurposed for purposes they had not been built to serve. Stairways that delivered a child to the wrong floor, on purpose as if to test whether fear improves memory. Severus watched Draco's pallor deepen into a color not found in the names of paints, but in the leaves of plants grown in cellars. He realized, with a precise grief, that the boy had been handed an instrument he didn't know how to hold, and that every day he held it, it cut him in a dozen places that did not bleed where anyone could see. He tried to teach Draco how to bandage those cuts without teaching him that the instrument was wrong, a contradiction that scraped the throat even as it was spoken. The night itself arrived as so many do, by degrees, with the moon looking the same as it had on nights when nothing irrevocable happened. You can remember the smell of grass and the feel of stone, even if the next hours make those details feel like cheats. There was a scream in the dark that sent students scurrying like birds flushed from a hedge. There was fire where no one had ordered fire. Severus moved through the castle with the economy of a man who has been practicing this particular terror for a long time. His robes did not catch on anything. His wand hand did not twitch. His breath did not speed until he turned the last corner and saw the shape that would write itself into every dream he had left. At the tower's top, the sky stood cold and exact, as if stars were pins holding a map to a table. Draco, shaking and thin with dread, held a wand as if it might bite. Dumbledore stood with the grace of a man who has already accepted gravity. Other figures slid out of the night like thoughts a man does not wish to think. Severus climbed the last steps and looked toward the man he had been keeping alive and found in that old face the kind of trust that makes and unmakes a person. Severus, please. It was a sentence that could be read as rescue or request, mercy or resignation. He had known it would come. He had agreed to it. Still, in that breath, he tasted every refusal he would not make and swallowed them whole. The spell he cast was clean. It had to be. In the moment between the flash and the fall, Severus thought of a riverbank where a girl had laughed and a boy had believed that naming a leaf's transformation meant owning the future. He thought of a nursery that had been and a boy's scar that should never have been. He thought of Dumbledore's hand in his, steady as a metronome against which death had tapped the last of its patience. He said the word. The body tipped, fell, and the night swallowed it without chewing. There are acts after which a man does not own his own steps. Severus ran, but his running was the kind that keeps pace with a vow rather than with terror. He shepherded Draco as a man shepherds a candle through wind, not because he liked the light, not because he believed it could illuminate anything ahead, but because letting it go out would make the dark complete. He fled through courtyards set alight by other men's joy and destruction. He cut his way through a field of looks that would all, later, be filed under words like traitor and murderer and always. Harry pursued, shouting accusations whose heat Severus took as payment rather than injury. He silenced the boy not because he wanted him voiceless, but because a loud child at the edge of a cliff needs to be still. He left, because leaving was the next step in a choreography written across years. He left, and the castle behind him folded into a shape it had never learned before, a shape made of grief and fury and the brittle concentration of underfed bravery. In safe houses that were made safe by custom rather than by fact, men thumped his back and called him by names that were both endearments and drills. He did not correct them. He accepted bread he could not taste and cots he did not lie down on. The Dark Lord's approval came like weather. It made the room colder without moving a single flame. Severus bowed, and in that bow was every inch of distance he still intended to keep. Headmaster. The word looked wrong beside his name, like a coin minted with the wrong monarch. Yet the office opened to him when he spoke, and portraits turned in their frames with a front they did not bother to veil. He took the chair because the chair had to be taken by someone who would use it as a shield instead of a lance. The new regime arrived at the school, like a disease that believed itself a cure. Carrows stalked the halls with glee disguised as discipline. Lines carved themselves into children's hands as if skin were paper that needed correction. Severus placed himself between the worst of it and the children as often as geometry allowed. He could not be everywhere. He was everywhere he could be. There were nights when his own house, those serpents and cynics and orphans of affection, looked up at him with eyes that remembered being human and asked for the kind of help that cannot be written in a ledger. He gave detentions that led nowhere. He assigned patrols to students who needed to be on the other side of the castle for reasons they were not permitted to admit. He sent owls with feathers that did not match the ink they carried. He played the tyrant so that the real tyrants would feel less need to sharpen their knives. The mask fit too well. That was its function and its curse. Children who might have loved him learned to fear him. Children who should have feared him learned to perform for him the loyalty he performed for those above him. Children who would grow into the men and women who would tell the story later stored him under headings the stories require: villain, traitor, enigma. Some nights, the statues in the corridors seemed to have turned their heads so they would not have to watch. Some nights, the phoenix that no longer inhabited that office flickered in his mind anyway, a warmth that could not be summoned but was not entirely gone. He spoke, occasionally, to the empty air as if the old man might still be there, invisibly adjusting the hinges. He received, in answer, silence he trained himself to read as assent. He poured memories into a bottle to stop them from boiling in his head. He poured others down the sink because a man cannot carry every version of himself and walk. The order that mattered next did not come from a man. It came from a logic that had been training itself since the prophecy first took a deep breath in that upstairs room. The Dark Lord wanted the wand buried with a headmaster who had once held it. He wanted mastery. He wanted inevitability written into wood and bone. Severus, who knew the grammar of power in ways the Dark Lord never would, because power had used him as a noun and a verb and an adjective, and still asked for an adverb, understood the rules of mastery. He also understood the mistake into which he had been led, and the shape of the price he was about to pay. He went where he was told to go. The room smelled of damp and scales and old water. Snakes glided in and out of the visible as if existence were a courtesy they offered out of politeness. Voldemort spoke as if the room were listening and pleased. Severus answered as if words could be folded into armor. He thought, very quietly, of a boy walking corridors 7 floors up with a map that hated him and a purpose that would outlive both of them. He thought of the doe that had learned to step without sound through snow. He thought of a silver shape moving through a forest to say, follow. The snake struck when the wand's logic required it. Pain teaches lessons too fast for the body to translate into language. Severus fell and understood, in a sharp, almost clean way, that a story had reached the place where the last page has more weight than the first. Harry was there, of course he was. Of course he would be. Faces gather at the ends of stories that belong to them. Severus summoned the last of his discipline, which had never been for himself alone, and lifted memories out of his skull as if pulling a net from a river where fish gleamed with all the hours he had lived. Take it, he said, and the words were an act of faith, and an order and a gift and a plea. He wanted the boy to see. He wanted the boy to know the arithmetic and the expenditure, the interest charged and the compound result. He wanted, most of all, for Lily to walk again in a room where she had not walked for years, and for her son to see the shape she had made in the air of a world that had not deserved her. He watched those memories leave like birds, startled by a door slamming. He tried not to watch the boy's face. He was too tired for pride. He had only one more thing to say, and he said it because the desire to see a certain green one more time was not a desire that could be reasoned with. "Look at me," the boy did. For a breath, the world and the woman were the same color, and the man who had lived long inside a cold house of his own making felt. Finally, the fire he had kept banked reveal its core. If the story ended there, it would be a neat lesson and an untrue one. Ends are not ends. They are rooms with many doors, and those who remain must walk out of them with whatever light they can carry. Severus's light had been hidden so long that most who told the tale would not recognize it if it warmed their hands. That did not change the fact that it had burned, steady, lonely, exact. And if somewhere, beyond telling, a river runs through a town that can only remember the names of its factories, and if a small boy with bad hair and a careful mind sits on its bank with a girl who will always deserve better than the world will give, and if the leaf in his hand turns at last into the thing he has been trying to name all his life, then the man who kept the worst vow perfectly has, at last, a room inside the story where he is not cold. There would be one more night of work for others, one more hour in which a boy would pour the contents of a vial into a headmaster's basin and watch a life rewind itself into mercy. There would be a wand passed, and a wand refused, and a wand recognized. There would be a forest where surrender looked like defeat and was not. There would be a castle where portraits woke and statues marched and children chose. Severus would not walk those hours. He had already laid their track and paid their fare. The next steps belonged to those who had not been asked to spend their lives in advance. The last thing he kept for himself was a silence no one could misuse. And somewhere, in a place no map bothered to mark because it belonged to no one, the shape of a silver doe moved through snow that did not melt, leading whoever needed leading to water that remembered every face it had ever reflected. If you followed her far enough, you reached a clearing where night was not the opposite of day but its companion, and where a man who had been a wall finally sat down and allowed himself to be a door. The last vial waited in a shallow stone basin, as if it had been there since the castle learned to stand, as if every hour had been distilled into that small, luminous weight. When the boy tipped it, the surface lifted him down into memory's quiet, and there was Severus again, not as a rumor, not as a hard line drawn across corridors, but as a life unspooling, thread by careful thread. The room filled with younger voices, a girl laughing by a river, a boy holding a leaf like a question, a classroom humming with the low thunder of boiling cauldrons, an office where lemon and ash scented the air, and plans were laid with the neatness of chess. The boy watched the scenes pass, and with each one, the angles of his anger loosened until something like grief took its place. A grief for a man who had kept his back to the sun, so that others might walk in light and not notice who was casting the shade. There was the night in the forest, silver breathed into shape, a doe stepping out of darkness without sound, her hooves pressing no mark into the snow. She moved the way a memory moves when it has learned to be gentle with the heart that carries it. She led the boy to a black lake and to the sword that slept under the ice. She was a map drawn in moonlight and a vow given a body. The memory showed how Severus had conjured her, how the Patronus had stepped forward as if she had been waiting in him all along. No flourish, no triumph, only the quiet of a love that refused to die and refused to be loud about it. Another memory, far older and far colder, carried words spoken between two people who had both learned how to speak like instruments, not voices. "You have been feeding him to the wolves," Severus had said, and Dumbledore's face had worn the sorrow of a man who knew there were no wolves and sheep anymore, only creatures doing what hunger required. In the remembering, Severus's contempt looked like a shield hammered out of fear. He did not want the boy to be a plan. He did not want the plan to have a grave already sketched into it. And yet the same memory showed Severus agreeing, because agreeing was the way to keep the plan from becoming cruelty for its own sake. He would do the unspeakable, and others would speak about him as if the unspeakable were all he had ever been. The boy rose from the basin, not older so much as correctly aged. Knowledge can do that. The room was as it had been, and yet it contained a man it had not contained before, Severus, remade in understanding. Outside the stone and echoes, the night had gathered into the kind of battle that makes a building. Remember, it is a body. Walls shook, windows shivered, stairs flinched and endured. Children ran with courage too new to know its limits. Adults followed with courage old enough to know exactly what it cost. The boy went into that dark with a new weight in him, the weight of a debt he had not known he owed, and the odd lift that comes from realizing a hand has been at your back for years, steadying your steps when you didn't know you were tilting. What remained of Severus lay in a place that smelled of damp stone and snakes, the air heavy with the quiet that comes after violence has finished using a room. No crowd gathered, no applause or condemnation. He had died as he had lived, privately, at the hinge between two doors, with the worst work done so someone else could walk through. If there was a witness at the last, it was a boy whose presence had already begun to turn into a story. If there was a word, it was a word that asked to see her one more time, and did. The castle did not refuse him a place. The portraits muttered. The gargoyles kept their granite counsel. It has always been the way of stones to understand that stories are layered, and that the ones told first are seldom the ones that last. In the days after, the castle learned to say his name without letting it curdle. Students whispered at the long tables, dividing him the way children divide clouds into animals, this side a monster, that side a guardian, the whole of it turning and turning in the wind until one day it looked simply like weather and they could go on with their meals. The boy walked the corridors he had run through, slower now, a hand trailing walls that had guarded him without asking for thanks. He stopped at a window that faced the lake. It was calm that morning, its skin untroubled except for a single ripple that traveled from nowhere to nowhere, as if the water were remembering something and then choosing to forget again. He stood there a long time with the kind of stillness that is not emptiness but the fullness of a decision. When he turned away, he carried with him a sentence that did not belong on any plaque or banner. It belonged in the mouth of a man who decides what to do with a future suddenly placed in his hands. Live it and spend it generously. Years have a way of softening the sharpest outlines and burnishing others until they gleam. The war became a set of dates that children learned in class. With the same dutiful faces, they turned to goblin rebellions and werewolf accords. The boy became a man who stood in rooms where he had once stood small, and he did not stand alone. He married the companion who had walked with him where maps refused to draw roads. They built a home that knew laughter as a language. In time, they carried small hands across platforms where trains inhaled steam in futures. The man knelt, once, to look into a pair of green eyes set in a face that was not Lily's and not his, but a new thing the world had not seen before, and he chose to give that child a name that folded history into hope. 2 headmasters, he said, when someone asked why. What he meant was, 2 men who taught me what it is to hold a life that isn't yours as if it were. The world never fully agrees on its saints. It cannot. Saints are usually people who have been transformed into symbols, and symbols do a poor job of sleeping, of making tea, of flinching, of failing. Severus did all those things, and then did the thing that made the others matter. He kept going, and he kept his going aimed at a purpose that asked to be served without seeing the face of the person serving it. There were those who never forgave him, and their refusal had honest reasons. There were those who forgave and then forgot, which is a kind of amnesty history sometimes offers the living in exchange for moving on. There were those who felt suddenly gentler when they remembered the feel of a classroom's cool air and the way a strict voice could, without admitting it, save them from their own carelessness. In the quiet places where stories do their slow, important work, Severus's life shifted into its true proportions. Not a neat arc, not a redemption sung from a balcony, but a long, hard practice of choosing the next necessary thing. A man is not his best moment any more than he is his worst. He is the sum of his evenings. He is what he does when no one knows what he is doing. He is the difference between what he wanted to be and what he had the courage to become when the wanting no longer mattered. Once, years later, a former student found herself in a corner of the library, no one used, except on days when the weather insisted on rain. She had a headache made of grief that had nothing to do with wars and everything to do with the way a life can turn inside out with no one watching. She sat where the dust rose to meet her and put her head on her arms. When she lifted it, there was a smell of cinnamon and clove and something sharper, cleaner, almost mint nothing visible, only the memory of a scent that had learned how to live in stone. It made her breathe deeper, and then again, and then she stood and went back to the work of being a person. The castle had kept it for her. The castle keeps a great many things. There is a room in the dungeons where the tables are scarred and the cabinets are labeled in a hand that does not curve or flourish but tells the truth of where things are. If you are the kind of person who sits very still, you can feel how the air there holds on to meanings. Valerian, asphodel, fluxweed, loyalty, stubbornness, precision. The way a hand learns to move steadily even when the heart is a storm. The person who teaches there now is not the person who taught there then. This is as it should be. And yet the discipline remains, not as fear, but as a kindness strong enough to wear a hard face when required. Children learn that some rules are scaffolds, not cages. They learn to keep time by the turn of a spoon and the slow pulse of a simmer. They learn to apologize to a cauldron when their impatience makes it spit. At Spinner's End, the river still moves under a sky that has remembered both smoke and blue. The factories are more ghost than machine now, their windows blank, as if waiting to be written on by a different weather. Very few people walking there could tell you who once stood by those reeds and made a leaf into a lesson. This, too, is as it should be. Not every place needs a plaque. Some places do their honoring by continuing to exist exactly as they always have, so that anyone who needs a quiet bank to sit on can have one without feeling as if they are trespassing on sacred ground. The sacred is capable of disguising itself as ordinary in order to be usable. In the world where memories have their own geography, the ones Severus left have stopped running like water and settled like glass. Clear and exact. There are moments you can hold up to the light and see through, a hand making a precise turn above a flame, a jaw setting as if to refuse, then opening to say yes, a doe stepping into a forest no one else remembers until the moment they need to. There is the sound of a word spoken at the last that was not a spell and not a curse, only an instruction to the universe. Let me see what I loved one more time. The universe complied, as it does when it is asked with the sincerity of a life spent asking. Sleep, if it is kind, returns us who read to the rooms where these things live, and lets us walk among them without needing to change them. In those rooms, severities have softened, and the walls do not demand explanation. Dumbledore sits with his hands folded, not speaking, as if silence were a language he had been longing to try. Lily stands by a window that lets in green light, and it suits her. The boy who became a man fast enough to save a world, but not so fast he forgot how to be afraid, comes in and sits down. Severus stands a little apart, as he always did, and then, because the laws in that place are written by forgiveness, not accounting, he takes one step closer. No one remarks on it. That is the generosity of a true ending. No one needs to narrate it as it happens. Here, in the breathing world, night quiets the roofs one by one. The castle sleeps the way old creatures sleep, with one eye half open and a dream that holds all the rooms together. Far below, the lake keeps its secrets in the broad pockets of its dark. In a corridor where the portraits do not quarrel after midnight, a draft lifts the corner of a carpet and sets it down again as gently as a hand laying a blanket over a sleeper. In the classroom with the scarred tables, the glass is clean, the burners off, the labels squared, the knives edged to the back of the drawer. The room waits, tidy as a thought you will return to in the morning. And if you listen in that spacious hush, past the hush itself, you can almost hear his kind of order, the soft chime of a spoon against a beaker, the paper whisper of a page turned with care, the inward click of a man deciding, yet again, to be precise where he could be bitter, to be loyal where he could be clever, to hold the line he drew even when it drew blood. The world does not owe him a statue. It owes him what it owes anyone who kept their vow in the dark. A light left on in case they ever pass this way again. So we set one small, steady, nothing theatrical on the sill of the story. Let it burn, just long enough for you to find your way to sleep. In that soft glow, he is no longer a riddle or a blade or a room without chairs. He is simply a man whose love learned how to stand upright in a storm and then taught his fear, patient night after patient night, how to do the same. Close your eyes. Let the silver shape step out of the trees and turn. Once, to be sure you are following. The path is clear enough for dreams. The water ahead is still. The sword you thought you'd never reach glints under the ice, waiting, as all true gifts do, for a hand made quiet by purpose.